Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. So I have a bit of a confession. I've basically copy-pasted my entire coding career. Honestly, it's basically how I've survived over the years as a developer. On every team where I was working, I took note of what the smarter developers were doing. I copied from the right people at some amazing companies, and I worked with developers who I truly think might be genius. One started a multi-million-dollar business. Another wrote a popular library for unit testing that you've probably heard of. And the last one called me out on my ridiculous BS at my very last job. Helped me out incredibly. So I stole a little piece of each of these developers to accelerate my own career. I've been very lucky. I live in the epicenter of the tech universe in the San Francisco Bay Area. Every nerdy developer with a dollar and a dream somehow ends up in this place. You don't have to get lucky, though. You don't need to live in the overly priced Bay Area to learn this stuff. So what I want to do is share the lessons I learned from each of these characters that saved me from mediocrity and might help you on your journey. Here's something I've realized over the years. You won't recognize what's bad until you've experienced what's good. How do you know what bad is? Until you know what good is, right? When you're writing code, you probably don't have a lot of context or reference. So you write stuff that works and you think, hey, this is good. It works. Wrong, bucko. But that's okay. We'll get to that. So before I met these superstar developers, I was aiming too low in my career. I learned to code at 30. You've probably heard the story. If you've been listening to this podcast before, check it out if you haven't. Had a crazy, salacious past of crime and drugs and all this stuff. So at 30, I was just happy that somebody hired me. My main goal, if I'm being very honest with you, was just not to get fired. I was aiming to be average, and I still fell short of this very, very modest goal. Here are phrases that you'll often hear from subpar, below average developers. It works on my machine. I don't know how it works. It just does. Don't touch it. My favorite one, I just write the code. I don't care about the business or how that works. And the final one, looks good to me. Plot twist. I've said every single one of those things. Extra plot twist. That last line almost got me fired. And we'll get to that one soon. Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you're interested in becoming a software developer, learning how to build complex software, and actually get hired, join me at parsity.io. If you're serious about joining, just schedule a call with me by clicking the link in the show notes below. You don't need to job hop 6 times in 10 years, move to the overpriced Bay Area, and go to a bunch of tech companies and stress yourself out and lose all your hair like I did to become a slightly above average coder. Here are the lessons I learned from each of these 3 nerds that I met over the years. First off, there was the salad eater. Let's call him Don. This dude was a genius. I could tell he was a genius because when we went out to eat on the first day of work at this really small startup, we were with the CEO and the CTO, the whole executive suite, and me and him. We go get a salad. This dude just starts eating it with his hands. And it is causing a bit of a spectacle because we're like, what's going on here? Why would you do that? Next, he basically asked if he could go home early because he was tired. He's like, I'm kind of tired. Are we done yet? Basically. The next few weeks, he did a bunch of interesting moves. He was incredibly talented coder, but he would come to the office and take a nap on the couch. He would just say these off the wall things. And it was so wild that he would get away with it. I'm like, okay, only a genius can get away with stuff like this and not get fired on the spot. If I had done that back then, they would have said, you know what? We don't think this is going to work out too well. This dude, we can call him Don, switched careers at 40. He went from medicine to software, which tells you a bit about how smart he might have been. He was in his 50s when I met him. Again, against this whole stereotype or image that everybody has that, oh, there's nobody coding after 30. I'm 30. Am I too old to learn to code? Oh, I'm 25. Am I too old to learn to code? No. I'm not going to get into the myriad reasons why there's no age limit on coding, but many of the developers who I've worked with over the years, and a couple from this particular episode, were over 40 when I met them and still writing code on a daily basis, and they were the top developers in the company. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it. So at the time I met Don, I was entering my 3rd year as a developer. I thought I was basically mid-level at this point. I thought I was doing pretty good. Wrong. So when I pair programmed with him for the first 2 weeks in the job, I quickly learned just how junior I was. Pair programming, by the way, is when you sit at the same computer or maybe you're remote and then you are using the same keyboard, you're programmatically typing on somebody's screen or something like that. You're trying to figure out how to implement some code together. So one person will say, I think we should go this pattern, or let's start off by creating this file. And somebody will type and somebody will kind of drive, quote unquote. Driver is usually the person typing. Then the other person will kind of guide them. And you may take turns switching on and off. And when you have somebody that's really junior and somebody that's really senior, it creates this delta of knowledge that is really hard to fill in. So you end up doing something like just telling the person what to type, which is really not fun to do. So pair programming can be a chore, honestly, for the senior person, and it can be really, really helpful for the junior person because you're getting all this knowledge. So Don wrote tests for all the features we were using a library that he actually created. He was the author of a library for a framework we were using. Pretty intimidating to work with that guy, right? You're writing a test and you're using the library that he made and he's telling you how to use it. At this point, I had never written a test in my life. By the way, unit testing, writing code that tests the output of your code is incredibly common. I do not know why more boot camps and colleges do not teach this, but they don't. But it is an expectation on the job. By the way, at Parsity, we absolutely teach this kind of stuff. In fact, we spend a lot of time on back-end unit testing as well as on front-end unit testing. But at this point, I wasn't so lucky. I didn't go to those kind of programs. I didn't know anything about writing tests. I'm like, just seems like more junk to do. Anyway, Don was like, you're going to write tests. He had keyboard shortcuts to fly around his terminal and code editor. He was a master at his code editor. He had keyboard shortcuts. He had snippets of code that he could like copy and paste with a few keystrokes. He was in his terminal and he had alias commands. So instead of typing out like a full command like git checkout or git add or doing all these git commands, he had aliased them. So he could type something like GB, which would stand for git branch, or he could type GCO, which would stand for git checkout. Just all these little modifications, which made him just a little faster. And I've done an episode on this exact subject that includes a shortcut cheat sheet as well. And if you're interested in getting that, just reach out to me through my email or something like that, and I can send it over to you as well. Basically, at this time, I was like, I don't have time for that kind of stuff, right? I just want things to work. Like, that's cool, he's doing this. But hey, look, I'm just here to get things working, right? But he wouldn't accept that. He refused to work with me until I learned keyboard shortcuts for VS Code because pairing together was a chore. He did not like it. He was very upfront about that. He's like, look, until you know this stuff, I'm not working with you. Come back tomorrow. When you have this down, we'll start then. When I asked for help, he wouldn't give me the answer. He'd say, I think you probably want to look at this documentation. If I wrote a feature without a test and put it up for code review, basically the review that happens before your code gets merged into the production version, which goes out to the public, he said, no, I won't accept this. You need to have a test. We worked together for only 9 months, but I can't think of a more impactful stint in my career. I learned the art of testing, the importance of learning your tools, and most importantly, how to balance getting things done with getting things done correctly. Since we worked together, this dude went on to found a multi-million-dollar software company somewhere in South America, and I can almost guarantee you he's probably eating salad with his hands. Next up is the reviewer from hell, or maybe from heaven. I used to be super nervous when this guy would review my code. He would always leave a ton of comments. He would always suggest a totally different approach, and it was clever stuff. I was always like, why didn't I think of that? I learned over time that he was very meticulous with everybody's code because he cared. He would look at the code, he would really dig into it, and he would offer suggestions. It wasn't just like, you misspelled this variable, or I would rename this. It was more like, have you thought of this approach? Here's how I might do this. What do you think about this? It was like a conversation through comments in code, which is a great way to do code reviews. At Parsity, by the way, we have a code reviewer that looks over everybody's code when they submit it, and they leave comments and suggestions and things like that. Honestly, it can be a bit of a jarring experience because it's like getting your work edited. When you write something and somebody looks over it and offers suggestions, you're getting critiqued. And most of us don't like getting critiqued. I know I don't really like it, honestly. I don't really like critical feedback, if I'm being completely honest with you. I know it's important, so I seek it out when appropriate, but I don't always just enjoy it. I don't enjoy getting told, hey, this isn't working so well. Hey, I wouldn't do that. Hey, don't do that. These kind of things can be a bit emotional. So having somebody write on your code with 20 comments over 5 files of code can be a little deflating. And when you're a junior developer, you should fully expect that. And as a senior developer, you should also probably expect the same, depending on who reviews your code. Some people review very heavily. Some people are like a rubber stamp, which was me, right? I was the dude rubber stamping code reviews like a clerk in a mail office. I was like, looks good to me. Looks good to me. This team was full of senior developers. There weren't any juniors on this team at the time. I trusted that they had reviewed their own work, and I kind of treated the review as a formality, right? So one afternoon, me rubber stamping reviews all day long, cranking out code, and I get a cryptic Slack message, and it's the team lead. We'll call him Parker. And he says, hey, dude, do you have a minute to chat? And my heart immediately starts elevating the rate, right? I'm freaking out just a little bit. I'm like, oh, that's a weird way to start a message. Do I have a minute to chat? About what? By the way, if you're writing Slack messages to people at your company or Teams chats or whatever you're doing, please don't start off conversations with hey or hi. Just say what you want to say. I can't tell you how much that will raise the anxiety of an anxious person like myself. So me and Parker get on a video call and he says, hey, why did you approve this code review? He went over all the errors one by one. So embarrassing. He's like, how did you not catch this? This is a clear misspelling here. Or, hey, this obviously doesn't work the way it was intended to work. It was a really painful conversation, and I was super embarrassed. And he was right. I failed to do the bare minimum. And we nearly released this code. It would have crashed the app. It would have pissed off customers. It would have made us lose credibility. I apologized, and then I vowed to become the second best code reviewer on this damn team. So I asked him the next day, I said, Parker, how do you do code reviews? And he showed me his process. He would run the code locally and test out the functionality before even looking at the code. If it didn't work in the browser, there was no point in reviewing the code. He would then look over the new code line by line and understand what was being introduced. He'd ask clarifying questions. If anything wasn't obvious, he'd just ask. If it was a really big code review, he'd ask a developer to jump on a video call with him and explain it and then demonstrate the code for him. And the most important thing, he would always do his reviews in the morning before starting his own work, so that way he wasn't switching back and forth. He said he saved a chunk of time every day just for code reviews. I was like, damn, I'm not doing any of that stuff. That was a whole lot more involved than what I was doing. And I'm thinking, how am I going to make the time to do this? But I knew I had to, right? I couldn't afford to have another blow up like that. So I'm like, I'm going to stick to this and I'm going to see how it goes. So in my year-end review, after about 6 months of doing this, several teammates actually complimented me on my code reviews. My manager thanked me for being so thorough, and I felt like a good little boy. Honestly, I took this same approach to the next company I was at and redid their entire review process based on this one encounter. Super, super useful and impactful for my career and really helped me out because as much as writing code is really important, reviewing code and making sure that the team is not introducing bugs or not decreasing their code quality, making sure that you're basically like a shepherd of the code base. This is a very important senior level trait. And how do you do this? Well, one, you have to dedicate enough time to actually care and give a review the attention it deserves. This was super helpful in my career, and I can't tell you how much I think other people should also take much more time to do code reviews. It's pretty much a low-hanging fruit at most jobs because people kind of want to just get on with their day. So even if you're not the best coder, which I've never been, I've always been somewhere around average or maybe slightly above average, I try to stand out in other ways. And one of those ways has been doing good code reviews. Now for the last bandicoot. This dude I worked with really recently, the buzzword salad eater. I met James at the last company I was at. We'll call him James. And we worked together managing a small team of developers. I was the engineering manager, and I was in charge of creating our technical roadmap for the quarter. Basically, on a quarterly basis, I would think, okay, what do we need to build and do on this team to set us up for success? What are some technical features we should be working on? How do we prioritize them? How do we make sure we have the right amount of work that a team of X developers can do in X amount of time over a quarter, essentially, or maybe roadmap planning for the year. But this idea of road mapping is very common in tech and in product organizations in general. So I had this power, right? This is my first time being manager, and I was in charge of this pretty big effort of saying, hey, you decide what are we going to do this quarter. There was really nobody above me at this last company. So I had free reign. I was like, oh, wow, I can do whatever I want, right? And so I'm like, yeah, we're going to use all this new technology I've been wanting to work with, like Next.js and TypeScript. We're going to refactor this library that I wrote years ago. I bet I could even find a way to incorporate Kubernetes or something dumb, right? Just some buzzwords and tech stuff I'd been dying to try out. I was like, fear of missing out. And I'm like, I wanted to try to use these things in our place. It was going to be great. And so I go show James. And he just looks at this thing and he's like, what's the point of all this stuff? And I was kind of taken aback. I was like, And so I spit out a tech buzzword salad, right? I was really getting into my manager persona at this point. And I was just saying, junk like, static site generation can decrease the initial load time and SEO value and outdated version of Node.js and developer experience improvement. And it was just cringy, right? And he's like, hey, just stop right there. He says, honestly, I don't know what you're talking about. How will any of this help the business goals for the quarter? He was very, very direct, as developers tend to be, right? And I hadn't thought about that. He said, Brian, we're in the business of making money for an organization. It's totally fine if these things are needed or if they support some business effort. Otherwise, it's just fancy fluff. So he was right. I had to really question, why am I doing this? This isn't like some sort of educational purpose. I can just shoehorn all these things in, right? That's not a great way to run a company or even a small engineering team. It would have been really fun for us to do, but how is it going to impact the business? So I went back to the drawing board and I chatted with our product team where I learned what the business actually needed for the next quarter. I talked with the data engineering team and thought, what are some interesting metrics I can use to check to see if we're on the right track? We were in e-commerce, so I thought, what are some things we care about improving? Time on the site, average order value, SEO. Are these things we need to care about? Do we need to worry about decreasing the load time of the site by 200 milliseconds? Turns out we didn't, right? But it did include some other very interesting challenges like personalization. And that was really fun to take on. So I was really happy that I actually asked and got a good indication of what we really needed to do to move the business forward. So I had good intention. I just had wrong direction. And what James taught me in general was that tech is a small piece of the business. It can have an outsized impact, but only if you know what you're supposed to be doing. Too many software developers, they go out and think that writing code is the end-all be-all. And so they work on the wrong things. When you're a junior, you might not have any choice but to work on the quote-unquote wrong things. You get a ticket to fix a button color. You have to clean up some legacy code. You get the unglamorous work. But quickly through your career, you're going to find out that you need to be seeking out and finding what's going to make the most impact. What does this business care about? Is it money? It might surprise you, but sometimes it's not money. Sometimes they want to understand what the next big thing is. They want to know how to enable experimentation on their website. They might think, this website, wouldn't it be cool if we could change up the banner so we could test out all sorts of different promotions? Well, how can we enable that? If you're on the team that is in charge of that website, you could somehow make this feature a reality, and your marketing team could say, oh, that was great. We got to go through several iterations of a different promo, and now we've hit the one that works, and boom, now we're making a ton of money. I guess it all does boil back down to money, doesn't it? But sometimes you need to think, how can I help other teams that are in the business of making money or doing something the business has deemed important? How can I make their lives a little bit easier? How can I make what they do a little faster? How can I automate the things that they are doing? And that will lead you to all sorts of interesting problems to solve that the business will ultimately reward you for, or at least they should. You could also just get fired or canned like I did. I got laid off with a whole department of people, but still a very fun exercise understanding how the business works and how tech fits into that. So who will you be, right? Every good story needs a hero. And these three people were the heroes I needed at different points in my career. I adopted a lot of their habits and I applied their processes and their mental models to my own routine. And it worked very well for me overall. but I still use a fork to eat my salad because, I'm a normal guy. You know what else every good story needs? A villain. And unfortunately, I was probably the villain in some of these developers' minds or maybe on their teams. I was a burden. I produced sloppy code. I took too long to get that feature finished. That's okay too. They say if you're the smartest person in the room, then you're in the wrong room. Way easier said than done. If there's one takeaway from all these bandicoots, besides that you should write tests, care about business context, review code like you give a damn, it's this. Chase uncomfortability. Being around people who know more than you and studying them is the most efficient path towards being slightly above average in any arena. I truly hope that's helpful. See you again next week. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. If you're serious about switching careers and becoming a software developer and building complex software and want to work directly with me and my team, go to parsity.io. And if you want more information, feel free to schedule a chat by just clicking the link in the show notes. See you next week.